The post-lunch session of today's gathering. Thank you so much to the hospitality unit at the Hilton Hotel for a sumptuous lunch. Okay. So as you can tell, we are setting up the table here because we are going to have the signing of the agreement. So there is a slight change then to your schedules. And we have 6 member nations signing on to the agreement today. And with the signing of the agreement, it recognizes that domestic violence remains a pervasive challenge in the region. It affirms their shared responsibility to strengthen state responses, close legislative and policy gaps, and ensure accountability for perpetrators, and reaffirms a commitment to regional cooperation and harmonization to build more effective, consistent, and equitable responses across the Caribbean. The actual agreement agrees to endorse this regional agreement on legislative and policy priorities on domestic violence, adopt and publish a shared priorities document, establish a technical working group or special committee on legislative and policy reform, and ensure follow-up and accountability through the appointment of a special rapporteur or coordinating mechanism. The document will be made available shortly for signing by 6 member countries. While we await the actual arrival of the document, it has come to my understanding that some of you did not realize that Barbados was treating you to a wonderful activity this evening. Hands up who didn't know y'all were going out. Well, I have news for you. Y'all are going out. Yes, indeed. As a matter of fact, the coaches will be leaving here, the Hilton Hotel, at 6:30 p.m. You are encouraged, and I quote, to dress as casually as possible. Oh yeah, it's that kind of evening. And we're heading to the East Coast, to the Atlantis Hotel, historic place. It is gorgeous. It is beautiful. It's in St. Joseph, which happens to be the representing parish here of the AG. So you know he fussy to show you St. Joseph, and he should be. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous, splendid parish in the East. And the Atlantis Hotel, chef's kiss. You all will have an absolutely fabulous time. So make sure that you are dressed as casually as possible, dressed to have a good time. The coaches will leave here at 6:30. I've also been told y'all are so special. Y'all are getting police escort. Look at y'all. Just living that life. I love it. Love it for you. Okay. So Huey has been an absolute gem, making sure that I have everything that I need. Thank you so very much, sir. And most importantly, he's got the folder with the document. So have that after Guyana, Montserrat, St. Kitts. Yep.
So starting from Antigua, Barbuda, Belize, Guyana, Montserrat, and St. Kitts.
Okay. Many thanks. So what I'm going to do is when I call up the representative for the respective signing nation, you will just come to the table. As I said, Huey is amazing. We've got pens, we have seats, we have photos, and he will just point you in the direction of where you are to sign. It is a quick John Hancock, and we can consider this part of the afternoon complete. So I will call your member nations. You may all rise and come to the table together, because as you can see, we have enough seats to accommodate each of you. So I would like to call the representative from Antigua and Barbuda. I call the representative for Barbados. I call the representative for Belize. I call the representative for Guyana. I call the representative for Montserrat. And for our sixth signing nation, I call the representative for St. Kitts and Nevis. And I now leave you in the capable hands of our liaison, Huey. Antigua and Barbuda has signed. Barbados has signed. Belize has signed. Guyana has signed. Montserrat has signed. And St. Kitts and Nevis has signed.
Suriname would like to sign.
We would now like to invite, yes, keep these applause going for good reason. We are now inviting the representative of Suriname.
This point in.
Suriname has signed.
You hold the folder. Okay.
Can we shuffle them a little bit more so I can...
We will now have the official photo being taken.
We're done? Oh, the official photographer though. Good. Thanks.
We thank you all for your unwavering commitment through the signing of this document. We will now continue with the first panel of the afternoon, Integrated Survivors Protection through One-Stop Centers. This session will explore how integrated survivor-centered justice models, such as one-stop centers, are transforming the way justice systems across the Caribbean respond to gender-based violence. To open this session, we will first hear a presentation by Ms. Farmala Jacobs, gender specialist at the Caribbean Development Bank, on the role of one-stop centers to improve justice sector responses to domestic violence. We will then welcome our distinguished panelists, the Honorable Vindhya Persaud, Minister of Human Services and Social Security, Guyana, Ms. Jamie Saunders, Support and Referral Center, Antigua and Barbuda, and Ms. Janey Joseph, Center for Referral and Support, St. Lucia. We will then invite our speakers for this session to come forward. But right now, I hand the floor to Ms. Farmala Jacobs to begin this presentation.
Thank you very much, and a pleasant good afternoon to everyone. I'm not in the best position right now. I'm coming right after lunch with very limited time. So I'm going to power through this presentation and then invite the distinguished panel to share a lot more on what I will touch on very briefly. Just asking for the slides to be displayed, and hopefully this is not cutting into my 5 minutes. But I guess until the slides come up, I wanted to ask how many of you are familiar with the one-stop center model? Just by show of hands, if you're familiar with the model. Fantastic. So quite a few persons in the room are already very familiar with the model, but we have a lot of persons as well who aren't familiar with the model. So I think that this discussion will be very, very timely. So as was mentioned, this presentation will look at the role of one-stop centers to improve the justice sector response to domestic violence, and I want to broaden this to look at gender-based violence more broadly, the way in which the justice sector could be mobilized, one-stop centers could be mobilized to improve the justice sector response. So all throughout the morning for the day, we know what the challenges are, and we know that there is a lack of coordinated services that support the success of the justice sector. There's low reporting rates across our countries on domestic violence and different acts of gender-based violence more broadly, and of course there are low conviction rates associated with the lack of coordinated services that exist. And so the one-stop center model is being conceptualized, or was conceptualized globally, as a potential policy response that governments could adopt to address, to close some of these existing gaps. So what is the one-stop center model? It is an integrated facility that provides survivors with medical care, police assistance, legal assistance, psychosocial services, and social services, all operating and existing from one location. Some of the key features or some of the principles of a one-stop center model includes ensuring that there is accessibility, confidentiality and safety, empowerment, and of course, accountability. So it is very important to ensure that the model has within it built-in structures to ensure that the quality of care and standards are extremely high. Now, when we look at the Caribbean in action, we have quite a few versions or variations of the one-stop center model operating already in our region. And today you're going to hear from 3 distinguished models that are being established. We have Antigua and Barbuda, the Support and Referral Center. We have St. Lucia, that is currently establishing the Center for Support and Referral, the CPOR. And of course, in Guyana, you'll hear from Honorable Minister on the Hope and Justice Centers that have also been introduced. Now, the intent behind this one-stop center model is to ensure that there is faster resolution and processing of cases, high increased reporting, because the whole idea is that when there is improved coordination among actors, more persons would come forward to make reports. And of course, stronger and enhanced coordination across all of the sectors. So there's some global models. So we have in the Caribbean, but these are based on models that exist all across the world. And I have some examples here. I don't have the benefit of time to go through each of them. But the global lesson is that when one-stop center models are institutionalized and there is accountability frameworks around them, reporting increases, persons feel more safety, trust, and confidence in the system, and they would navigate the system, the court, the justice sector as well, and they would actually go from reporting all the way through when there is a coordinated approach in place. However, and we'll hear a lot about this in our discussion with our panelists, there are a few barriers that we have to take into account when implementing the one-stop center model. One of them is staffing capacity and ensuring that all persons have the appropriate training in providing these survivor-centered services, ensuring as well that there is cross-coordination and agreement, so all of the sectors must agree, and this has to be led by institutional, political, ministerial leadership to operate using this one-stop center mechanism. There is need for resource commitments as well. Too often we see these models being implemented globally that is funded by projects that have very limited funding after the project or the donor funding expires. Then the models are not sustained thereafter. There is also challenges with coordination, weak interagency coordination again, and that comes back to the political will and institutional and ministerial leadership. And we have also access when it comes to limitations. Sometimes depending on the size of the country, if there's only one-stop center operating, then we know that that will impact accessibility for persons in more rural locations. And we heard a lot about data fragmentation already for the morning. Now, there are some key enablers that we need to have in place for a one-stop center model to be successful. Some of these are clear protocols and MOUs between all agencies who will be operating under the one-stop center model. There has to be regular coordination and accountability, so there has to be some kind of review mechanism in place to ensure that there is quality and assurance of the processes and protocols being implemented. I spoke about strong policy and ministerial leadership, but there is also need for legislative leadership as well, and it would be good to hear from our speakers about that when we convene. Need for dedicated resources and digital transformation. Now, just to give an example of a model that has actually been able to improve its conviction rates based on using this one-stop center model. Quite a few of us, some of us here in the room, have benefited from going on study tours with UN Women to South Africa, and we were able to observe across the region some Tutuzilla centers operating there. And within this model, the Tutuzilla centers have seen an increase in their conviction rates by 50% based on the coordination that currently exists across their prosecuting units, across their social sector, health sector, and so forth. Now, just to end, there is need to have strong foundations being established. It is definitely important to ensure that the one-stop center model is integrated and in coordination with what's happening in the justice sector. It is not enough to just have a one-stop center operating within a jurisdiction without ensuring that there is appropriate coordination with ensuring that survivors are able to navigate the justice chain with support and assistance. There is also need to ensure, and I spoke about data already, so I'm not going to take up any more time. Just the last point I wanted to make on the one-stop center model before I invite the speakers, and this is around how do we actually measure success, measure the impact of these models. Now, there's very limited research and evidence on the impact of the one-stop center model, but there are quite a bit of testimonials, and if I had some time, I would have read some from you for survivors who have actually used this model in the region, who have spoken to the ways in which it has improved their confidence in the system and the ways in which it assisted with just them navigating the various sectors that they had to navigate. But when we consider how we measure the outcomes and success of the one-stop center model, we need to integrate metrics that allow us to see the reduction of time from reporting to if it's a charge or resolution of cases, for example. We need to also measure the rate at which the attrition rates as well as the conviction rates that have been improved as a result of the one-stop center models operating as well. So it is not enough for us to just count and say that we had 100 or we had 50 persons accessing the one-stop center for services. We actually need to see the ways in which the access has been translated into improved quality care, support services, and justice. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much. And I'll invite, sorry, I'm rushing so much. I will invite my fellow distinguished panelists to please join me for us to discuss this some more. Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, and thank you to my panelists, Honorable Minister Persaud from Guyana, representing the Hope and Justice centers. We have Jamie Saunders, Executive Director of the Directorate of Gender Affairs, representing the Support and Referral Center in Antigua and Barbuda. And we also have Janey Joseph, Director of the Department of Gender Affairs in St. Lucia, representing the newly established Center for Referral and Support, CPOR. So my name is Farmala Jacobs, as you would have heard, gender specialist with the Caribbean Development Bank, and it is indeed a privilege for me to moderate this session. So just to jump right into it, so I've done a presentation just sharing some of the global lessons around one-stop centers, some of the opportunities and enablers, some of the challenges and enablers. Minister Persaud, I want to start with you. Can you share a bit more for us on the one-stop center model that operate currently in Guyana? And what has been some of the policy and institutional drivers that have enabled the creation of the Hope and Justice Centers in your country?
Thank you. And first, I'd like to thank the conveners of this event for allowing us to have such rich discussions. And I'd also like to add my voice and my prayers to the persons and the people of Jamaica who are in the path of the Hurricane Melissa. So the Hope and Justice Centers would have been conceptualized with the intent of having a comprehensive response to gender-based violence in Guyana. They are gender neutral to begin with, and it came out of looking in depth at where our gaps lay as a country in tackling gender-based violence. And so the Hope and Justice Center emerged during the Spotlight Initiative, where we were looking at a single center that offered all the services to survivors of violence. And it really spoke to how survivors saw the existing systems, many of which started at a reporting point of the police station. And a lot of the survivors were not confident, one, that they would be listened to, two, that their report would go anywhere, and three, they were intimidated by their circumstance as well as threatened by the perpetrator of violence. So there were many, many barriers to access the service. So it was government's vision and government's desire to have access to service, to also look holistically at the system as it existed, and to develop a framework that was in alignment with legislation and policy. So we do have a gender-based violence policy framework, we do have a family violence policy, and we also have the new Family Violence Act. So coming out of that, the natural progression was for us to implement somewhere where persons could have access from the time of reporting. But this was bolstered by other services that we were working on prior to us opening the Hope and Justice Centers, namely the Survivor Advocate Program. Many a time you would have heard of women, or you know them, where they just don't know where to go, who to go to, and they're running to several buildings, and they're just not able to have all the stops in place. And so we conceptualized and developed the Survivor Advocate Program, where there's a person assigned to a survivor to walk them through the process. So the Hope and Justice Center starts with coming in, making a report to a police officer who is stationed there. Then they can progress to the medical station where they have the medical report done. Then they can access counseling, post-trauma counseling. And they can also have all of the support services of the ministry, which would vary from anything like placing them into a shelter, and some of our Hope and Justice centers have shelters attached to them, temporary shelters, and also we encourage them to access our free training programs for women where they can have financial independence, because usually that is something that precludes them from accessing any kind of service or getting out of any situation. And then they will also be able to access legal services. We have the legal pro bono services that is a little different from legal aid, because legal aid is offered by an NGO, and while heavily subsidized, the state wanted to have the opportunity to provide legal services to those who came with gender-based violence issues. And so we offer free legal support to anyone who walks through those doors and even beyond those doors. In fact, I'll tell you, we started something in the corridors of our East and West Coast where we have whistle-stop legal clinics where people who experience gender-based violence can access legal support anywhere in the country. We also offer, through the Attorney General's chambers, restorative justice options. So the Hope and Justice Center, while conceptualized by Human Services and coming out of the Spotlight Initiative to have this one-stop model, benefited very much from the IDB-supported criminal justice system that would have been done through the AG's chamber, and we were able to build those two institutions. So we have two on the coastland, and we have one in the hinterland. Now, the hinterland model is very different, and I'm sure you're wondering, what am I talking about? Our terrain in Guyana is quite challenging, and the hinterland requires you taking planes, boats, or going on long drives to get there. So we have offered an innovative approach, bringing the same services that we offer on the coast to the hinterland. The challenge has always been getting the kind of personnel to staff the hinterland center, and so we have just launched a paraprofessional training program with the University of Guyana to allow persons in the hinterland to study and work at these centers, so we are able to provide employment training while at the same time filling a void that exists. So when people come to the Hope and Justice centers, there is no doubt that they will have the kind of help and support. It's all free of cost, and it has improved the efficiency with which we target cases of gender-based violence. It has improved how we move to the courts. It also would have improved the confidence of persons coming to us. In the first year, in 2024, when we opened the center, we had just about 100 to 200 persons going through the centers. But now we have the traffic moving into the thousands, and the recent injection in that model is child protection, where we have placed outside our child advocacy centers, we have placed a forensic interview unit where children can do their forensic interviews in a protected environment, and that is also part of our Hope and Justice Center.
Fantastic, Minister. Thank you so much for taking the time to outline the ways in which you have considered all of the diverse needs of persons who would need to access the center into the design, and also just to tell us the way in which you've already started to bolster the model since you've launched. Congratulations on the launch, Minister. Just to turn our attention now to Jamie Saunders, who's the Executive Director in Antigua and Barbuda. Jamie, the Antigua and Barbuda Support and Referral Center was launched in 2017. And I am sure between 2017 to 2025, there are quite a bit of lessons that you can share around how that model has worked or not in terms of coordinating the police, the health service, psychosocial, and as well the justice sector for better and improved outcomes. Can you share a bit more on your experience with us?
Yes, definitely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Farmala. Before I start, just to commend Minister Persaud on her leadership of the Hope and Justice Center. I remember in 2023, you would have convened a ministerial meeting for the gender ministers, and so we would have actually got a chance to do a walkthrough of there, which was very impactful to see the work that they're doing. In terms of Antigua, we have the Support and Referral Center, which, as Farmala said, would have been established in 2017 through funding from the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. And it's a one-stop model that's geared towards providing medical, legal, and psychosocial services from one location. The referral pathway is a critical part of this framework because no one entity can do it alone. Survivors have a diverse set of needs and challenges that they are facing. And so as the title of this panel says, it is definitely an integrated approach towards tackling the issue. Some of our key referral partners would be Legal Aid, an NGO called Planned Parenthood that does work around sexual and reproductive health and rights. We work along with one-stop employment programs for persons who have those economic challenges, as well as a plethora of social protection entities as well, which survivors are able to benefit from in a complementary way if they have multiple intersecting needs or if it's just one of the respective entities. I think one of the things that Farmala said that is critical is having that political will, whether at the level of minister or permanent secretary. And that's why I made a point to commend Minister Persaud as well, because without that, sustainability is a challenge. You need the financing, you need that level of hierarchy of bureaucracy, so from the top you can ensure that there is accountability and compliance by those people on the ground. You know, one of the things that I think it was the Honorable AG from Guyana mentioned was that sometimes the police would have experiences where somebody would have been a survivor of abuse, they make a report, and then maybe afterwards they don't want to go forward with it. One of the things that we've done to the Support and Referral Center is trainings looking at how you take a survivor and client-centered focus, and part of that is understanding it's a very complex issue. So as much as that challenge of survivors not recanting, but maybe due to the traumas, due to the psychological underpinning things that are keeping them in the relationship despite the adverse impacts of it. If the judicial officials, if the key actors, the medical practitioners have that level of understanding that this is something that is actually common, and it can sometimes be due to isolation that the person has now been put in due to their abusive relationship. It could be due to economic reasons or otherwise. It would allow us to remove some of those implicit biases and to ensure that we have more empathy and we're a bit more strategic in terms of how we engage, as opposed to becoming more combative towards the survivor, which can perpetuate them not wanting to come forward again, maybe when they're in a better space. I think one of the challenges that sometimes we would face as well in operating the Support and Referral Center would be financing for sure. And a big example of that is emergency accommodations that we are mandated as the SARC to provide. And the demand for this type of service far surpasses our ability to supply it, especially a confidential, safe, and convenient location. And this is something that we understand from a government perspective. We're operating within a very small fiscal space. And one of the key points from this morning as well that was presented was the cost of gender-based violence in Jamaica. And that is a very critical study that gender equality social development practitioners should use when engaging policymakers, because the cost of inaction is astronomical, literally from a dollars and cents perspective. I think the final thing I would share is that last week, myself, as well as a colleague who heads an NGO called the Integrated Health Outreach, we would have presented to the cabinet on a proposal to have a shelter that would be the first shelter in Antigua established, which received approval. And I actually would have done an interview this morning on our state media, and an interesting question was asked. They would have asked, what do we see as the role of the Support and Referral Center in conjunction with with the shelter that's going to be established, if any. And I would have made mention to the fact that there's definitely an inextricable link, whether it's from the fact that the Support and Referral Center can serve as an entry point to people who will be making reports to want to be placed in the shelter, whether it is working along with the social protection providers, either while they are in the care of the shelter or subsequent to that, whether it's working on a safety plan for them. We provide protection orders and have a great rapport with the magistry. And so that's something that may need to happen, psychosocial support once they have left the shelter and subsequent case management. And so there's a lot of links, and it's a good embodiment and demonstration of how the one-stop model interacts with almost every single aspect of that cycle of care. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you very much, Jamie, as well. You gave a very comprehensive response, touching on quite a few things, including my follow-up questions I had planned for you. But I am really happy that you were able to take us not only through the challenges and opportunities, but also what are some of the things that countries should be considering around financing to sustain these models. So thank you very much. Turning to Janey from St. Lucia, the Director for the Department of Gender Affairs and the CPOR model, which is currently being designed to be launched soon, and the CDB is very happy to support the introduction of this model in St. Lucia. Janey, what are some of the lessons you've heard from my presentation? You heard from Minister Persaud on the Hope and Justice Centers in Guyana. You've heard about the Support and Referral Center in Antigua. You are at the starting point of your design and rollout, getting ready to launch. What are some of the considerations that you have been navigating in St. Lucia to ensure that you've integrated all of these lessons that you've heard about to sustain the model there?
Okay, thank you so much, Farmala, and thanks for having me here. First, to listen to some of the considerations of others who have gone before me, and also to share on some of the experiences that we have in just this process that we've started. So first of all, it's important to note that the One-Stop Center came out of the recommendation from an assessment of essential services that we had done in St. Lucia in 2019. And it was one of the very strong recommendations that came from several sectors that we need to ensure that the services are provided in one space so that some of the challenges that we are currently experiencing, we will reduce on them. And many of the challenges and many of the gaps that we identified in that assessment have been, you know, the same gaps that have been identified earlier this morning in the presentation, in Farmala's presentation as well. And the need for privacy was one of those very, very strong gaps. The sexual assault, for instance, was being done. Sexual assault examinations still being done in the emergency rooms, right? Persons who are victims of domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, they have a certain level of shame associated with what it is that they're coming for services for. So they need an opportunity to feel safe. Safety is one of the biggest things that they're dealing with. They want to know that when they're speaking to somebody that they're being listened to, but that other people who are not part of the story aren't hearing what they're saying. They want to also know that everybody doesn't know that that's what they're coming for when they go for the services, because to a very large extent, the experience for them is a very private one. So privacy was one of the things that we thought that the center, such a center, could address to a very large extent. Another thing was the fact that not everybody who was part of the institution where they went to access services understood trauma. And so when you're all in one space, and the space is trauma-informed, everybody now operates from that same understanding. And so it was important for us to put things together, put people together in the same space with the same values of a trauma-informed system, and get everybody now to be able to speak the same language, to provide the same level of care, well, at least standards of care that are similar to the client, regardless of, because the reality is that survivors of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, require several different types of services from several different agencies, from several different sectors. And so it is unavoidable that they're being referred from one agency to the other, from one sector to the other. So the sectors need to be able to speak to each other, and the sectors need to be able to speak the same language to a very large extent so that the client feels supported and, you know, helped throughout the process, regardless of what center they go to or what sector they're actually accessing the services from. And it's, again, the recognition that the survivor needs all of those different services. It made sense to bring them together so that we reduce the amount of time that it took from one set of services to the next. So sometimes the referral is made, and then the client has to wait maybe 2-3 weeks before they can get to access the other service. By that time, the client just chooses not to continue. And so you do recognize the implications for justice. So having all the survivors, all the services in one center would reduce, that was one of the recommendations, of course, is likely to reduce the amount of time that it would take from one service to the next. So these were some of the considerations. And the last one is the autonomy of the individual, because a client who has been a victim of domestic violence has had his or her control taken away from them. And so we took into consideration the fact that being in one center, the client can choose, you know, when they access the services, right? They know all the services that are available to them, and they know that they can come back to that same center at any point in time to get their services, the services that they know now already exist, and they know exactly how to access them. So all of these were taken into consideration, even hearing some of the experiences that Jamie and Honorable Persaud actually shared. It reminds me of some of the things that we're already doing, which is like, for instance, ensuring that there is a budgetary allocation for the continued functioning of the center when those CDB funding stops. So we've already submitted for our budget a recurrent spending for the center. And of course, it is our hope that if this center is successful, that other parts of St. Lucia can also have one-stop centers in keeping with what you know, Honorable Persaud made reference to.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Janey, for sharing the considerations for how St. Lucia is coordinating standards across multiple agencies to establish the one-stop center model there. Thank you. And you've also touched on the question of financing, budgeting, and sustainability of the model as well. So, colleagues, I'm going to ask one final round of questions and then open up to questions and answers, questions from you. So I'm asking you to please just think through your questions, because as soon as we've completed this round of questions, we will then ask speakers to engage with you in a very quick Q&A dialogue. Now, my last round of questions is going to be squarely linked to how are we bridging these models, integrating them within the justice sector response as well, because that is primarily the conversation that we're having here today and tomorrow. And Minister Persaud, I would like to start with you on the notion of leadership, because we've been hearing a lot about, in my presentation, I spoke about the importance of leadership. Jamie spoke about it as a lesson learned in Antigua and Barbuda. In terms of your own ministerial leadership, at the interministerial level, and we're able to hear from AG Guyana this morning, so we heard some very strong leadership coming from the justice sector there. But how have you been able to mobilize your ministerial colleagues in a way that will set some clear standards for accountability across the various sectors that they themselves lead to sustain this model and to ensure that it's operating at its highest quality?
Thank you. In the first thing, we are trying to address something that is pervasive, that is culturally embedded, something that has existed for eons, and we are looking at gender-based violence in all its nuances and dimensions. And when I got into office in 2020, the first month or two was spent looking at how we had a national response to gender-based violence to counter what we were seeing as rising cases in terms of women losing their lives. And in looking at that, it was to be objective, to be critical even, and to look at how as a government we can have that integrated, multi-pronged approach to, and multi-sectoral approach to really have an effective mechanism across all sectors. And it started with us signing on to the Spotlight Initiative 8 months after every country and going through the rigors of examining legislation, policy, and the existing services and how accessible they were to anyone, whether man or woman or even child, and looking at all of the dimensions of violence, things like elder abuse that people hardly spoke about, and really looking at how we can enhance reporting, because that was a challenge in our country. And right away there came the thought of having a 24-hour toll-free hotline, which we now have in our country. It was established in 2021, and from then to now, where we started with about 75 calls in that year, we're now seeing thousands of calls. We're looking at over 10, 15,000 of calls per year. And 50% of those calls are related to domestic violence or gender-based violence. And so it was here again, realizing that it wasn't only the reporting avenue, it was the law enforcement arm of things. And so I reached out to the Minister of Home Affairs, the Commissioner of Police, and brought them on board, because it was one thing to have a report, but then it was important to establish confidence. People will not use your system if they feel it will not work for them. People will not use your system if it fails them consistently. And so it was really having the boldness to say, look, you need to fix these things. We need to fix these things. And after that, immediately looking at other avenues of reporting, like for the first time establishing an iMatter app, which is an app that provides connection to the 914 hotline. It also now has a live chat feature that allows persons to connect, and it also provides resources that exist across the country. No matter where you are, you know how to get there. And then working on what I heard Jamie mention, which was a referral pathway, and ensuring that we didn't only develop the referral pathway, but we made sure that every person who was a stakeholder on that referral pathway got trained. There was ownership of the roles and responsibilities, and there was accountability. So we tackled the toughest nut first, and that was looking at the Guyana Police Force. And I conceptualized training 50% of the Guyana Police Force, and we called it the Cop Squad 2000. And so we started to train every level of police officer, and even now, myself along with the team will go from station to station to ensure that they understand what the law says they should be doing, and they're carrying out their roles and responsibilities. But what is really good now, we've gotten the buy-in of the Commissioner of Police to have accountability, which is something I really wanted to see. You can train, but how do you respond? And how do you have that feedback mechanisms? So soon the country will have a number of QR codes where there's a form that speaks to every encounter in a police station. So that form, once completed, will come back to us at the Ministry of Human Services, and then we will be able to send a detailed report to the Guyana Police Force and to my counterpart at the Ministry of Home Affairs, so that they can take action if police officers are not doing what they're supposed to do. Then came the Minister of Health. We wanted to remove the frustration, the hassle, and the bureaucracy, and not let survivors be lost in the medical system. Having worked myself in the emergency room, I knew how that could happen. And so it was bringing that minister and that sector on board and making sure they understood how important it was to have a timely medical report and a well-written medical report. And then look at case management document and case reporting across both sectors, creating digital databases that could be shared. That's something we are working on at present with IDB so that we can have interagency data collection and sharing. So our stats could be the same. And also we can have continued following up all the way to the legal system. And then, of course, the easiest one was convincing my brother, the Attorney General, to help us with building these Hope and Justice Centers. And together we embarked on a partnership where we built the Hope and Justice Center, we put in the comprehensive one-stop shop model, and thereafter brought in the element of restorative justice. So I like to say, hope comes from me and justice comes from him. And to every person who experiences violence out there, they need to have hope. They must have hope. Everything starts with hope. And with that level of optimism, then you can find justice. And justice is dependent on what we do, not only as policymakers, but how we can integrate our services for the best interest of the survivor. So it was a lot of moving parts, but it was also our government's commitment to developing a budget directed to subsuming the cost of violence. How, as a country, after the funding from the Spotlight Initiative, from IDB, and all of our international agencies, when that funding ceased after 3 years, were we as a country ready for this? And we were. And so we have continuity, we have expansion, and the thought is having more of these Hope and Justice Centers across the country. And we're looking not only at the building and the services we provide there, but the complementary services. For example, we do 3 months rental for any victim or survivor of violence. If they don't want to stay in one of our shelters, we actually pay rental for them. We give them a safe voucher, a survival kit, and so there is much more than just dealing with their immediate needs at the Hope and Justice Center. It is really looking at the person and getting them back to a sense of normalcy and being willing to review what we have done, constructive in our criticism too, and looking at how we can improve what we offer and still continue to look with a gap analysis of where we are in terms of effective services.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Minister. And I can feel your passion for this initiative. It's great to hear about the interministerial accountability mechanisms that you're putting in place in Guyana, because we know that these accountability frameworks are very, very important. Moving to Jamie quickly, looking at the one-stop model in Antigua. I know shortly after that model was launched, there was an emergence of a sexual offenses model court that was shortly established, seeking to bring together the one-stop center and the justice sector response. Can you share what are the benefits of having an integrated model of this nature that really blends the reporting all the way through to the justice sector? What was the intention? How did it work? And what are some of the opportunities that we can see coming out of having this mechanism in place in that way?
Yeah, so you mentioned the sexual offenses model court that would have been established in 2019, and that would have been through support from the Judicial Reform and Institutional Strengthening Project, which is Canadian funded, as well as the CCJ in terms of assist with implementation. And what that was and is basically a specialized set of court procedures looking to really remedy some of those systematic deficiencies that we see within our judicial process. So everything from cases taking 5 and 6 years after the initial incident to try to really improve how expedited these things can be resolved, and as well as remote testimony at the Directorate of Gender Affairs for vulnerable witnesses and children, mandated training of court administrators, officials, and judges who would be dealing with gender-based violence or domestic violence cases. That's what the model court was really created to try to facilitate, again, a survivor-centered, more efficient approach that would do no harm and really promote that type of framework. I think there was a multi-sectoral committee as well that was established as a kind of accountability mechanism, and to make sure that this integrated multi-sectoral approach can be maintained, and to ensure again that all of these different moving parts are not disjointed, but that they're cohesive and coordinated in terms of how we go through the whole judicial process. You know, the question that you asked in terms of the importance of legislation, that is critically important. Legislation, policy, and even unofficial policy in the absence of formal one. In terms of the legislation, we have our 2015 Domestic Violence Act. And what I like about that piece of legislation is that it highlights the different forms of gender-based violence, which is important. Because if you are coming as a survivor and you're saying, look, I've been emotionally and psychologically abused, but the legislation only supports physical violence, then you would not be able to have any reprieve to the law. So our domestic violence legislation is progressive in that way, as well as actually listing out the Directorate of Gender Affairs in the language as an entity that can provide protection orders. For this year so far, we've had about 32 requests for protection orders. 30 of them were granted. The 2 that weren't granted was because they changed their mind in wanting it, and the legislation being in place has almost fostered an environment where the magistrates work along with the department in understanding the importance of responding to these protection orders and the filings in a very time-sensitive way. Most times they're reviewed the same day or the latest the next day, which bodes very well for the clients. And so those are some ways in how you see legislation being very important. I think in terms of policy as well, you know, that's what would have allowed us to have a special victim support unit reinstated and located within our building, which outside of just having the one-stop model, also allows those officers to embody on an everyday basis, understanding those principles that form part of the integrated and survivor-centered approach. And I think just outside of that, legislation and policy allow for enforcement, because it's easy to advocate, it's easy to talk and to know what is right. But I think when we actually have the legislation and policy framework to support that, it's conducive towards what we need to see happen actually taking place. Just one thing I'd want to say from almost as something to advocate for and to provoke some thought is that a survivor-centered approach is indispensable, but I have heard mention of and have liked us needing to also in the region look towards the rehabilitation programs. I know UN Women has done the Partnership for Peace, and I know in Grenada there's been statistics to show reduced recidivism rates. I think that's what we need to truly become a bit more preemptive and to ensure that we can break the cycle. Yeah.
No, thanks so much for sharing on kind of the experiences that you've been navigating in Antigua and Barbuda as it relates to linking the justice sector response and the one-stop center. And to your last intervention, I think we have an entire panel dedicated to exactly what you've just raised. So tomorrow should be interesting for that discussion. Just finally turning to Janey, St. Lucia. Janey, in terms of ensuring that your one-stop center is also integrated with the justice sector, what kinds of conversations, agreements, policy, protocols are you exploring with the family court, with the justice sector more broadly in St. Lucia? And hearing from Minister Persaud, hearing from Janey about the accountability mechanisms that these models require, how are you thinking too about these types of accountability frameworks for St. Lucia's operations?
So I'll start by saying that partnerships, for sure, have always been at the center and around all that we've been doing for all of these years as it refers to response for all forms of GBV, including domestic violence. And it's because of those partnerships in the first place that we are where we are right now. One of the institutional mechanisms that we've established since 2024 officially was the National Interagency Task Force for Gender-Based Violence Prevention and Response. And on that task force, we have 3 representatives from the justice sector unlike in the other sectors, where there are one or two representatives. And one of the reasons why that is so is because justice is so much at the center and at the end and at the beginning of the whole process, right? I think that we all want greater access to justice at the end of the day. And so many of the other services that we're engaged in is ultimately towards ensuring that the client gets access to justice. So partnering with the justice sector means that they're influencing the process in various ways. So they're influenced, like for instance, like I indicated to you, there are 3 representatives on the task force, right? So you have the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Director of Family Court, and the Director of the Forensic Laboratory Services. And what they're doing is that they're influencing what happens in the policing sector. So to a very large extent, they give the idea as to how policing can improve what they're doing so as to ensure that evidence is collected, the evidence has a value in court, and also that the storage of that evidence is taken very seriously so that it can actually be used. The forensic lab, in a similar sort of a way, reminds people that, look, when this thing comes to us, it has to be usable, or else we don't get to get the justice that we're actually looking for. So the medical persons, the persons from the health sector who are involved in service delivery, take into consideration those aspects of justice that we generally did not take into consideration before. Because as a health practitioner, you're primarily concerned about, the person's health. Yes, you're collecting evidence, but, your greatest concern is ensuring that that person is, is in a better state of health than what they came in for. So having them on board and having those interagency conversations opens our eyes to all the other, factors that line up towards justice. Also, the partnerships helped in improving the legislation to begin with. So we have a very robust Domestic Violence Act, I think that was mentioned a little earlier on today, because of the fact that so many agencies involved in service delivery were part of the process in saying that, look, we need to change that because that's one of the issues that's bothering us, right? And so, and again, like I said, justice is central to that because then they can clearly show what the outcome is when we don't take these things into consideration. So the one-stop center provides this, but even more importantly, the institutional mechanism around coordination, provides that even better.
Thank you so much for sharing the ways in which St. Lucia is considering the types of coordination that needs to happen with the justice sector. Particularly, I pulled out the ways in which the one-stop center models could assist with the collection of quality evidence that helps with the outcome of these cases. So colleagues, thank you so much for listening to the initial interventions from our panelists. At this time, I'd like to open for questions, reflections, or any immediate reactions that you might have on anything that you heard from any of the speakers so far. Sure, we have one intervention. Do we have any more? 2 interventions. I think we could squeeze one more.
Good afternoon.
Okay.
In Belize, we don't have a one-stop shop center, but the panelists spoke extensively on the issues regarding police officers and the training they are receiving. I have some questions in that regard. I would like to know whether or not your services are being accessed by police officers as victims. And 2, whether or not you have any statistics regarding police against police being reported at your centers, because without internal policies in the police departments and without police officers being able to feel that they can go to their superiors to report these matters internally and get internal assistance from their departments, it would be difficult for a lot of people in the department to report this.
Thank you so much for your question. Do we have any immediate reactions from any of the speakers?
I could share, since we do have police officers making reports, and their report is treated the same way as anyone else walking in. Their disciplinary measures, however, are different within the structure and the hierarchy of the Guyana Police Force. However, we have spent a lot of time working with the joint services, education, awareness of our services, and we find after all of those sessions, people will come forward and we will have that kind of complaints coming out of those sessions as well. But we do cater for that, and it is dealt with in the very same way.
Thank you so much, Minister. Jamie, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so we also have had police come in. It's not common to see in the sense of like intimate partners, 2 police officers involved in the case that's coming in, but we have seen, for instance, a survivor coming in and maybe their partner was a police officer and there would have been reservations around that. And I think one of the important aspects of not even just a one-stop center, but just in general, any type of service provision in which there's accountability is that you're going to have aspects of, not conflict of interest, but maybe where you have to be contending with certain power imbalances or things that make the issue a bit more complex. And we've been very strident and open in terms of not making that distort what we know our duties and mandates are, to the point where sometimes we maybe even put ourselves in danger as people in this field, in the sense of going with the survivors to the police station and demanding to see persons and calling out things and holding them accountable in that sense. But we definitely advocate to the public a lot to let them know, no matter what your race, ethnicity, profession, socioeconomic status, the services are available to you.
Thank you so much for those responses. And then we have one final question or intervention at the back. My colleague at the back.
Thank you. So it's not so much a question as a comment and an encouragement. I'm Showing Toyin Stevenson, the Program Manager for Crime and Security at the CARICOM Secretariat. And just reflecting on the example provided by Guyana through the Honorable Minister, to me demonstrates the effectiveness of a ministry, in this case the social, that is responsible for social development, to be able to convene the other sectors around areas of crime prevention, and we have the instance of gender-based violence in this instance, to convene and collaborate and arrive at a workable solutions, particularly looking at some of the primary and tertiary prevention methods. I know we're very strong in the region on the secondary aspects of it in terms of enforcement, but it is also encouraging that this model that the Minister has identified also has links to the Attorney General Office, where legislative issues that could arise through the, through the filtration of the issues across the various sectors could be addressed. So I just want to thank Guyana for providing that input. Thanks.
Thank you, and we appreciate that intervention. We have one last intervention from Justice Hines, and then we will come back to the panel. Justice?
Yes, it's a question. And I'm not sure if it is relevant to either any one or all of the jurisdictions. Are the entry points for your one-stop centers always the police? And if so, have you considered adopting other approaches, especially when an earlier presenter acknowledged the fact that people do tell, they do talk. The actual entry point, so to speak, for some people is not necessarily a person in authority like the police. It might be a faith-based organization. Have we considered an entry point like school guidance counselors, where a child speaks up about what is being experienced at home? Maybe they are not the ones actually feeling physically the violence, but they're seeing it and witnessing it being meted out to one parent or the other, recognizing this is not a gender exclusive dynamic. But entry points that are softer, so to speak, to access all of the one-stop measures.
Thank you, Justice. And I know the nature of the model requires multiple entry points. So I'll just allow speakers maybe to share just 1 minute on what are some of the entry points outside of the police that you're currently looking at for the referral pathway system.
Well, for the referral pathway system, yes, because I can't speak to the one-stop center as, that, because once the person accesses services at the center, the first person that they speak to would be the case manager. And that case manager tells them of what services are available, and then they choose their services moving forward. In terms of referral generally, there are various entry points in the referral pathway. So you can access through schools, yes. You can also access through medical institutions from other, as a matter of fact, many of the persons who are accessing services for GBV access them through NGOs. Yeah, because they would have gone through there as their entry point.
Fantastic.
For us, we have multiple entry points as well. The 914 hotline, the iMatter app, through the live chat with any one of our entities. We also have the Support and Heal Network, which is a combination of over 40 faith-based organizations across the board. We can have a number of NGOs reaching out to us, schools as well. And we've started something called the Community Advocate Network and the Child Advocacy Network. These are persons, regular persons out there who would have been trained by us to recognize signs and to give information and education in their own communities. So pretty much a random person can make a report. When they call through or when they give that report, we don't need their identity. So it allows for that level of confidentiality, and it increases the instances where people will want to report. And I agree with you, it has to be the softer side and not only the police station. But our most successful program has been our Survivors Advocate program. These Survivors Advocates are at our various offices, centers, and at the magistrates' courts. And so persons will come through them, and they actually handhold persons, for want of a better way of putting it, all the way through all of the services as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much as well, Minister. Jamie, you had anything to add? Or
Just really to echo the same sentiments, there's different entry points, whether through the hospital or we have the social services department at the hospital, schools, we have an NGO, Women Against Rape, the police, gender affairs, we have a 24/7 hotline. So definitely a good point that you raise. People don't always trust the police or even gender affairs, so it's important and it is in place.
okay, so thank you so much. And to wrap us up, I'm following the precedence that was established by the previous panel. 30 seconds. Any last words that you would like to provide on what we have spoken about today? I'm going to go in reverse order, so I'll start with Janey, then Jamie, and then Honorable Minister.
Survivors' outcomes, especially as it refers to access to justice, is everybody's issue. That this is not an only justice sector issue. It's not an only social sector issue. Neither is it only policing sector issue, and that we collectively own the outcome. That we can help improve services across the board if we all accept and own the outcome as a collective thing.
Thank you, Jamie. Janey.
Yeah, so just to say, having an integrated approach towards providing services and justice to persons facing gender-based violence is critical in order to have a strong, holistic, institutional response. You need the government, you need NGOs, we need faith-based organizations, we need citizens to change their perception of it. We heard a lot of people talking about perceptions of man and woman business versus taking a more proactive and mature view towards the issue. So just encouraging a collaborative approach by state and non-state actors, and encouraging our policymakers to ensure that the legislation and policies are in place to support those grassroots as well as government level responses.
Thank you so much, Jamie.
I just want to raise 2 points. First is to always constantly revise the legislation. We have managed to repeal the Domestic Violence Act of 1996 and replace it with the Family Violence Act, which gives expansive coverage, which the AG spoke about. So it's looking at the evolution of violence, the definitions of violence and abuse, and how legislatively and policy-wise we can cater for those things as they arise, as we continue to move on, and also looking at things like cyber violence, digital violence is now a thing. So being very up to date with how we're going to deal with that through the justice system. And secondly, is to create innovative programs that are transformational and impactful and sustainable, and to never exclude the perpetrator in all of this, and to look at men in particular. A lot of times we spend and we look at a focus on women, we look at that through a gender lens, and everybody, when they hear gender, they think women. But we've just had a Bridging the Divide policy that focuses entirely on men, and we have established brave centers where the word in itself, brave centers, will not stereotype or profile a man as a perpetrator, but looks at every aspect of what he's going through: empowerment, fatherhood, partnerships, relationships. So it is looking at the holistic image or the holistic narrative of when we try to tackle violence. And we are seeing excellent response from the men as they come on board. And we are looking at how we can tackle the root cause of violence, because we can put the world of services in, but if the population and the target audience is not part of what we're doing and they do not relate to it, then we will fail. So it is being willing to even look at your own systems and review them, and if necessary, recreate them, reinvent them, and to look at what works around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for today's panel. I think this was a very informative session, and I think based on what we have heard, coupled with the prevention programs and initiatives that we know are so necessary and important, one-stop centers, if implemented correctly, have the potential to transform justice. It has the potential to improve and save lives. Thank you so much for engaging with us, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much to our esteemed panel for a very engaging discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to power through the coffee break, because that is just who we are. But feel free, if you want a little pick-me-up, you can always grab it, come back inside, because we certainly do not want you to miss out on our final panel discussion for the afternoon. Also, we want to make sure that you have enough time to do a little networking. If you wish to go back to your room or your respective hotels, whatever the case is, and change, remember, as casually as possible, because you are going to be treated this evening at the Atlantis Hotel, and you certainly don't want to miss out on that opportunity. So we want to give you enough time to get yourselves ready for that as well. So as we move into our final panel of the day, it is titled Strategic Information for Enhanced State Responses to Domestic Violence. This session will explore innovations in information and monitoring systems designed to strengthen justice responses and prevent repeat harm, especially in the most high-risk cases. Our experts will discuss tools such as registry systems, predictive risk assessments, and fatality review models that enhance state accountability and reduce repeat victimization. We're going to have a slight change to how we're going to do this. So what I'm going to do is invite our panel, who is going to be on stage, to come and join us on stage when I call your names. Dr. Corin Bailey, University of the West Indies, who will be speaking on assessment of sex offender registries. Dr. Lawrence Sherman, Cambridge University, the METS V100 program in the United Kingdom, and Mr. Mark Perkovich, Arizona State University, who will speak to fatality review and risk assessment. And without further ado, I now hand the floor to the moderator of this session, Mr. Alliston Seal, SC, Director of Public Prosecutions acting in Barbados. Please give it up for our esteemed panel.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, Janice. We are hearing you.
Okay, good. So thanks for the invitation to this symposium. And we're here today to present on the Sex Offender Registry of the Government of Jamaica. And I also have joining me my Chief Technical Director, the Ministry of National Security and Peace, Ms. Shauna Travers. And will be joining us also Ms. Melissa Dobson, the Registrar for the Sex Offender Registry. So I'll be sharing my screen and I will start the presentation. Are you hearing me okay, Heather?
Hearing you just fine, Janice. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So a background to the Sex Offender Registry in Jamaica. For a period in Jamaica, we were experiencing unprecedented levels of sexual violence, and this had a serious psychological impact on victims and communities. Although these offenses were addressed under other acts, it was determined by the government of Jamaica that these were ineffective in treating the specified type of offenses. These acts under which they were being treated were the Offences of the Persons Act and the Incest Punishment Act. So accordingly, the government of Jamaica decided to establish the Sexual Offenders Act, and this was done in 2009, which we were hoping it would modernize the law regarding sexual offenses. Thereafter, the Sexual Offenders Regulations Act was later developed in 2012, and this led to the operationalization of the Sex Offenders Registry in July 2014. Having established the registry, there were a number of objectives that the registry was slated to meet. And just a few of them are to protect children and vulnerable adults against sexual abuse from convicted sex offenders, and also to deter sex offenders and prospective sex offenders from recommitting and committing sexual offenses, to offer sex treatment program towards effective rehabilitation and reintegration of convicted sex offenders. And we're also, another objective is to monitor the movement of convicted sex offenders in order to protect children, victims, and the general public. It is also of interest to note that another objective of the registry is to provide details on convicted sex offenders to persons or organizations with legitimate interest in obtaining this information. So I might just pause to say at this time in Jamaica, our sex offender registry is not public. However, persons who have legitimate interest under one or more of the listed offenses. And in our Sexual Offenders Act, we have a number of offenses that are listed. And these persons are convicted whether they're serving a custodial or a non-custodial sentences. So this goes to show that this reflects neither dangerousness nor severity of the crime. It doesn't matter. Once you have been convicted of a sex offense that is listed, you are deemed to be able to be registered. Another work of the Sexual Offenders Registry is to let the public be aware of the nature of the operations of the registry. Hence, regular public sensitization activities are done mostly at secondary school, tertiary level institutions, churches, and to the judiciary staff. We also share information with other agencies, particularly the police, where information on the registry is divided into tiers. And as such, I'll just speak about tier 1. Information can be provided to members of the JCF, that's the Jamaica Constabulary Force, persons engaged in professional counseling. So if you're a counselor who's working with a sex offender, you can get information on that person. Prospective employers of persons who are registered as sex offenders, and persons managing educational institution where the sex offender intends to enroll. For this application, each application is to gain information must be submitted on a prescribed form that is in the regulation for the sex offender registry. We also look about rehabilitation, reintegration programs for our sex offenders. And we mostly focus on the cognitive behavioral therapy and helping them to understand sexual violence. And some of the programs that we have in place currently within the Department of Correctional Services or the Offender Group in Rehabilitation Guide, which is used to transform life and restore hope, and the Step Out and Strive program, which we use to assist members in changing values, attitudes, belief, and to gaining empowerment. Is Dobson? So I'll continue. Ms. Dobson is to present on this slide, but I'm not. So the total sex offenders, do not see my screen?
We can see the presentation.
Are you seeing my presentation? Heather?
Yes, we are.
Okay. The total number of sex offenders as at September 2025 was 480 sex offenders. 423 of them were registered and 57 of them were unregistered. And by this, some of the time the persons are to be registered, but they do not turn up at the sex offender registry in their parish to be registered. Hence, at times, the registration officer would have to go to their addresses that they would have given and file and ask them to come to the center to be registered. And this is a breakdown of the sex offenders that we have currently in Jamaica. We have community-based that are registered, community-based that are unregistered. We have prison release that are registered and prison release that are unregistered. And our largest piece is those who were released from the correctional centers, and that's 238 persons, and those persons are registered. So all this saying to say that majority of our sex offenders in Jamaica have been registered on our sex offenders registry. And we have here the categories of offenders. The most, which is 304 persons who are charged with the offense of having sexual intercourse with a person under age 16. And running second is the persons who have been charged with rape at 52, incest at 28. We have indecent assault at 21, and we have a category we call other, that for those that are not listed above, at 28. So these are the categories of sex offenders, and this information is at July 2025. The Jamaican delegation is happy that we're at this conference, symposium, because it will help us to interact with persons from the region and international, so we can have some collaboration, that we can seek to understand how other systems are available to register sex offenders, because we just use one system, and I'm sure there are other systems out there. I heard Mr. Lawrence spoke about the risk-based, and also the utilization of data for policy development and its alignment with domestic violence. The Jamaican government is also looking at legislative and policy review, and in 2016, a joint select committee for Parliament reviewed the Sexual Offenders Act, and it was agreed that based on current formulation of Section 5, rape could not occur within the context of marriage unless certain conditions were met. So these conditions, which were in the legislation before, place the married woman in a disadvantaged position when compared to other women in relationships. Accordingly, it was recommended that Section 5 of the Act should be deleted. Consequently, upon this agreement, it was noted that a woman, whether her consent, once a woman withheld her consent to sex in a relationship, irrespective of whether this occurred in a marriage, it should be considered as rape. So this in itself linked closely to domestic violence. And a number of women were happy when this change was made in the legislation. Nonetheless, we still have a number of challenges, and I'll just list a few. Sometimes we have a non-receipt of court transmittal documents from the court in order to effectively register the sex offender. We also have challenges with the registration of children, the non-compliance of some offenders, and also limitations in monitoring our intervention programs. Because our intervention programs are mostly within the correctional center, then so at times it is difficult to measure whether or not the investment in the person would have yielded some results, because at that time, whilst they're within, they're not exposed to the person who may be able to trigger a sexual need. Hence, it's kind of limit us in measuring the intervention programs. And as we have challenges, we're also coming up with some solutions, both legislative and policy. So we have established working groups. One working group is to conduct legislative and policy review of the Sex Offenders Registry, and another working group is to develop appropriate programs for effective rehabilitation and reintegration. The technical working group established since September 2025 to review the Sexual Offences Act and to determine the feasibility of publishing the Sex Offender Registry. Now, in recent days, there have been a number of activities, criminal activities against women and children of a sexual nature, and the public have been asking for the registry to be made public. So the Ministry of National Security and Peace, and by extension the government of Jamaica, is doing a feasibility study on this aspect to see whether or not this is a way that the government would want to take. And also another solution we're looking at, just before I talk about that, the members of the technical working group span from a number of government agencies, a representative from the Ministry of National Security and Peace, representative from the Department of Correctional Services, the Jamaica Constabulary Force, and the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. Another solution we're looking at is a special project within the Department of Correctional Services to design a curriculum for special categories of inmates to include sex offenders. And this project, the personnel on this project consists of clinical psychologists, sexologists, and senior members within the Department of Correctional Services who have in-depth knowledge of offender assessment and treatment. So now with this program, we'll be better able to monitor the intervention being provided to our sex offenders. I want to thank you for participating, and if there are any questions, I will be happy to respond. And my team is also here, Ms. Melissa Dobson, the registrar for the Sex Offender Registry in the Department of Correctional Services, and my esteemed Chief Technical Director, Shauna Travers. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to all. I think we'll go straight into the panel discussion because we are kind of pressed for time. Our format will be a little different because we'll have to truncate it so that we can get out of here as soon as possible. I don't want to press on your time. I understand the time constraints. With me is Mr. Corin Bailey. He's to my extreme right. Professor Corin Bailey, Director of the Center of Criminal Justice and Security at University of West Indies. And to my immediate right is Mark Perkovich, an accomplished law enforcement executive with over 20 years experience in the public service of Arizona. And joining us virtually is Professor Lawrence Sherman. He is a professor in criminology at the Cambridge University. Now, I want to start right away with Professor Bailey. And to you, sir, having heard about the experience in Jamaica with their sexual offenders registry, we want to begin this discussion on information and monitoring to improve state responses and reduce harm by asking you about some of the academic work that you have done on the subject of sex offender registry. And in particular, I want to ask, what does the regional and international evidence say about sex offender registries and its effect on recidivism?
All right, thank you. Afternoon, everyone. I enjoyed I think that presentation was a good jumping off point for us. So I just wanted to say thank you to them. I agreed with a lot of it. Agree is a weird word. I'll get into that. But certainly didn't agree with the last part where they were speaking of investigating whether or not to make them public. I mean, to the extent that my opinion matters, I could not be more against the public registries. But I want to answer your question to begin by kind of agitating, troubling this whole notion that they these registries reduce recidivism in the first place, because that really is at the base of why it is that we implement them, or they are implemented. And every time there is a public an incident that comes to the public's attention, we often hear people saying, where is the register, where is the register? And I just don't think necessarily that many people understand that it doesn't necessarily do what you think it does. But that assumption is inherent in its implementation. And I would suggest that in many cases that assumption, that premise is faulty. So just let me run through a few things here to consider. So firstly, these offenses are generally committed by people who are already known to their victims. So we have this kind of vision of this intruder that might snatch a child out from a window, or drive up in a community and say come with me. And that's not to say that doesn't happen, but that isn't the norm. And I want you to think of everything that I say this afternoon as my encouragement for us to always be evidence-based in our policy formulation as it relates to crime prevention. So secondly, they're generally committed by those who have never been convicted of a sex crime before. What that means is that they would not be covered in a registry to begin with. Now, thirdly, we already know that with some nuance, recidivism among sexual offenders generally is low. We know it to be, not only is it statistically low, but a lot of recent evidence shows that it is extremely low when compared to other forms of offending as well. So the evidence in terms of success as it relates to registries is at best inconclusive. But I think it is safe to say that the majority of studies lean towards there being no statistically significant impact on reducing overall recidivism. As I said, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but that is the general empirical evidence. And then also we cannot ignore the evidence that indicates that in some cases, rather than reducing recidivism, registries actually can have the propensity to increase it. They typically exacerbate exclusion. We know that incarcerated individuals have to be given the best opportunity to reintegrate into society. So I was happy to see from the presentation that that's a part of their plan. So anything that hinders that reintegration, therefore, has a potential to increase reoffending. And so research has pointed to the destabilizing effect of these registries. Okay, so there's also the issue of resources, and as I said, there are a million reasons why it is I'm against the implementation of the public registries, but there is some empirical support for the use of private registries, but only in and so far as they serve as a monitoring tool for law enforcement to help with investigations of new crimes, and to just to offer effective monitoring of offenders. I do think that it can be argued that is a good use of resources. There is no doubt that a well-monitored offender of any kind is less of a threat to society than one that is not monitored effectively. And so the benefit of a private registry, in my mind, is in its utility to serve as a monitoring tool, and certainly is a better use of resources than those that are public. But we also shouldn't hide from the fact that in most societies, sexual offenders are statistically low-risk offenders when compared to other crimes. And what that means is that there is no doubt that sexual registries of any kind divert resources away from high-risk offenders towards low-risk offenders. And that is not an issue in societies where resources are not an issue, right? But I don't know that to be the case in any Caribbean country. So a final point as it relates to resources. So generally, as a rule, I strongly believe in prioritizing true crime prevention over law enforcement. That does not mean that I think law enforcement is not important. Don't come for me. I'm saying that it is. There has to be it has to work in tandem. We tend in the region, we have a history of prioritizing law enforcement over true crime prevention, and so any measure in my mind needs to operate in tandem with improved reintegration. As I said, I was happy to say that in the presentation. Social support, employment opportunities that need to be made available for recently released sex offenders. There is no greater threat to recidivism than an offender that has not been effectively reintegrated into society. We have this toxic relationship in the region with punishment and incarceration, where we give it out with the knowledge of the harm that it causes, and we might push them back out into society ill-equipped to re-assimilate, and then we're all too happy to lock them up again, or we even express shock, or in this case we say, okay, we have to monitor them to make sure that they don't do it again. But they really have not been given an opportunity not to. So if we really are serious about trying to reduce the chances of recidivism, then they need to be given the best opportunity to be productive members of society again. And we have to consider that when talking about allocating resources.
And still with you, Professor, are there specific challenges Caribbean countries face in implementing offender registries? And what are some of the important design considerations for Caribbean states to have in mind?
Lots of challenges. As it relates to design, I want to bring up that topic that has been touched on of risk assessment. And as I said, I do believe there's utility in it as a monitoring tool. But any registry, in my mind, has to incorporate a validated, standardized risk assessment tool. That means you really do understand who is at risk, and you're able to classify into low, medium, and high, and maybe treat those offenders differently. And so that ensures that those efforts and potential restrictions are proportional. There are technology issues, as we know. Unfortunately, many law enforcement agencies in the region, they still rely on maybe manual or paper-based, certainly some totally non-digital systems of record keeping, and of course that makes things like registers even more difficult to implement, and certainly more difficult to maintain. And then there's the issue of information sharing. I think that was touched on in the presentation as well. We have to establish those clear legal and technical protocols for information exchange, and then of course there are financial and technology challenges. We can't overcome the fact that Caribbean countries will have to overcome financial and technological deficiencies that are present in able to sustain an up-to-date registry. But importantly, I again want to touch on, as it relates to challenges for implementation, touch on this issue of non-public versus public. Because for me, given the empirical evidence that public registries do not significantly reduce recidivism, the primary function of any registry, if deemed necessary, in my opinion, should be one of a non-public, intelligence-driven tool for law enforcement. So certainly private. Now, linked to this issue of challenges in implementation, we have the challenge of, this is just one of the many issues, we have the challenge of public perception and response to that perception. We have a culture of jungle or vigilante justice in the Caribbean. In fact, it is one of the most severe and harmful unintentional consequences of sex offender registries. Many times, people who are calling for these registries, we need to know. We have to really consider what they will do with that knowledge when it is they know, or what they really want it for. As I said, the evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that knowing really would make a difference. The registries should be designed. They are designed. The intention is to promote public safety, either by informing communities or law enforcement. But that public notification feature can transform into a mechanism for extra legal punishment, and that certainly undermines rule of law, and for me is one of the massive challenges.
Okay. And finally, Professor, what are some of the important considerations around privacy and rights to due process that need to be considered relating to offender registries, and how can these be best addressed? I just want to add to me, a registry, sex offender registry, as opposed to any other registry. If you're talking about crime generally, the thief doesn't register anybody else and say, well, I'm a thief, watch your bag. But the sex offender registers to say, I'm a sexual predator.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Answer that.
Right. I mean, I could talk about this forever. I won't, I promise. But for me, the biggest consideration is how to balance public safety with the significant human rights violations that are inherent in a registry. You know, I'm often told as a criminologist I'm too concerned with the issue of human rights, but you know, here we are. Let me just read an excerpt from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No one shall be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor or reputation. Everyone has the right to protection of the law against such interference and attacks. That's very hard to overcome with something like a registry of any kind. And in my mind, it's one of the strongest arguments against its implementation. They impose significant collateral consequences. They are unavoidable for registered offenders when it is that they are trying to reintegrate into community, and it affects their social, their economic, their mental well-being. And much of it is as a result of infringements upon their right to privacy. But even aside from privacy, obviously, is like isolation, stigma, harassment, employment discrimination, residential discrimination, bullying. All of this exacerbates issues of poverty and homelessness, and all of it has the potential to feed back into a cycle of recidivism that, of course, defeats the whole purpose, right? So even if you think that they don't deserve their privacy, because in many audiences I'll speak, you know, I might be saying, you know, they deserve their privacy, and people are like, no, they don't, who cares? But I'm saying even if it is that you do not accept that they deserve their privacy, then maybe think about the fact that it can increase offending, that it actually can exacerbate the problem and not solve it. And so, honestly, for me, it comes down to two things. One, if considering the evidence, that violation of human rights is worth the implementation. And two, how can a registry be implemented in a fashion that does the least damage? And as I said, in my mind, it's about, if implemented, it's about effective risk assessment and monitoring rather than the implementation of a broad-based registry. Certainly not one where everybody knows who's on it.
Thank you very much, Professor. Next, we move to Professor Lawrence Sherman. He is with us virtually. I'm hoping that he's still awake.
Yes, I'm right here, and I'm wondering if you can see my slides. Can you see these slides?
I can see you, but I can't see
well, I'm
your
afraid
screen.
that the capacity to share. Oh, hang on, here it is. There. Now let's get the slides into the sharing. And
yes, we can.
How does that work? Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so
thank you,
I want to
Professor.
show.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for joining us virtually all the way from Spain. It's somewhere after 9 o'clock, I presume. I anticipated that you may be in your pajamas.
No, actually, there is a conference dinner here in Spain where we're talking about the ways in which to get people to obey the law that are aside from what we were just hearing about, or the dangers to human rights. And I think an alternative to the idea of the sex offender registry, which is I think motivated by the idea of scarce resources, and you need to concentrate on the most dangerous people. And there's an alternative way that doesn't need to be public. Certainly, the way we've done it at Scotland Yard, it has not been public. But it's also much more dynamic. That is, you come on and off this registry based on a constant flow of information about 35,000, mostly men, a year, who appear in the victim's statements about who committed a very serious crime against them, or indeed any kind of violence against a woman. And I would like to show you that this is the curve that you get when you record for each suspect named by victims, female victims of violence, what crimes were allegedly committed against them. And with a court backlog going up to 5 years, using the victim statements rather than waiting for convictions, which would be way behind the times in which people are active in committing violent crimes. What you're seeing here is a stacking of 35,113 named suspects. The victims said committed crimes against them, including attempted murder, rape, grievous bodily harm. And what is computing the height of this location of each case is the number of days of imprisonment recommended by the sentencing guidelines and the judicial framework for that in the United Kingdom as delegated by Parliament. And on the far left-hand side, you can see that there's an offender who in 1 year was reported by multiple victims to crimes that added up to 13,000 days of imprisonment. Just divide that by 365 and see how many years they would spend in prison if they were convicted. Now, what is this used for? It's not used for something that requires a conviction. In fact, just the opposite. It's used to prioritize what the police do with people who are alleged not by one, not by two, but generally by 4 victims of committing extremely serious crimes. And the question really is, in many cases, whether the victims will provide the testimony. Once they report the name, they very often decide not to cooperate because they're afraid of retaliation. But we have had, and I can't give you the statistics publicly yet because they're not through peer review, but we have had in the top 100 offenders getting extra police attention through investigations using all of the rule of law requirements. We have, by virtue of the offenders knowing the police were investigating them, we've had a 50% drop in the amount of harm that the victims are reporting that they're causing. And this kind of dynamic approach that is focused entirely on resource allocation, prioritizing the scarce number of police investigative hours with the people who, not from any one case, but from multiple cases, coming together to be added up and ranked for police allocations. This has been a way of taking a very overworked police force, may even have police officers laid off. But what most is most important is this difference between the top 100. And if you look in the middle of this distribution, what you'll see is the median, the midpoint, out of 35 suspects named by victims, at the midpoint of the 35,000, just about 16,000 of them had 11 days of recommended imprisonment, compared to 13,000 days of recommended imprisonment. And if you take the Cambridge Crime Harm Index, which uses the sentencing guidelines to estimate the total harm that any offender is accused of committing or convicted of committing, and in the slides that you can request IADB to send you, I've got the links to these articles. What you're basically seeing is the answer that I gave as Chief Scientific Officer at the Met to the Commissioner of Scotland Yard, saying, you want to know who, based on the latest information from crime victims, who are the most dangerous men in London today. That's what helps to allocate the resources to the greatest return on investment which looks something like this, that the highest levels of harm produce a massive share, sometimes 80% of all of the harm is caused by under 5%, and with 100, you generally get under 1%. So this 365-day sweep can be done weekly, it can be done monthly, but it basically takes the victims and not the police intelligence or even professional judgment to just focus investigations, to not put them on a list, not circulate it publicly, but to go to victims and say, can you give us the information we need to file an indictment and to proceed with a criminal prosecution? And that group that they're going to stands as high above the average or midpoint offenders of violence against women in London. It's as tall as that 73-story building called the Shard, the highest building in London, except there's 10 of them. And that's how much higher the level of harm is, if you can accept this metaphor, than the average building down low on the ground. What we want to do then, I think, is to look at the ways in which we can protect women more effectively by giving full respect to the rule of law, but also calculating a metric that applies equally to everybody who's been accused by a victim. And if we look at the wisdom of crowds and across all of those many victims, an average of 4 victims per suspect in the group of the top 100, this gives us a basis for, I think, doing the kind of work that will have more benefit, and we've already shown that benefit is there for these most dangerous men who are doing so much harm to the women who report their crimes. I'd be happy to answer any questions or to supply the slides to anybody who asks for them.
I just want to ask one question. What are the underlying requirements for the Harm Index program to work?
First, you need a sentencing guideline system or a surrogate. Now, the surrogate that is easiest to develop, it requires some digitation, but basically, if you take the average sentence for each offense type, we have 800 offense types or close to it in England. And in fact, our Office of National Statistics does this in what they call the crime severity score. They compute the average number of days of imprisonment for each crime type. And then if you take all those crime types that are being used to commit crimes against women, and limit your stacking to that number of days of imprisonment, that would go with a conviction for each and every offense that a female victim reports to the police as a suspect. So you add up the values from either the average sentence, or in the case of the UK, we can use the sentence guideline, which is less dependent on the prior criminal history of the offender. The sentence guidelines are done in a more philosophically abstract way. The actual sentences are pulled up by the prior history of offending, and that's old history. The great thing about a sentencing guidelines system is that if you're just looking at the past year, it's recent behavior. So it's not just severity, it's recency. Whereas anything that goes back to the entire criminal history, I think, as we heard from my academic colleague in Arizona, you're kind of denying people the right to reform. And the great thing I feel about this system is that it's very recent. It's got multiple victims who are currently at risk, and it allows people to get off that list. The suspects won't appear on the list in the next year if nobody's reported them as having committed those offenses. And in any case, the names would not be brought to the public. So I hope that answers the question, Mr. Chairman.
It does. Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you for joining us, notwithstanding the time difference.
My pleasure.
Now to you, Mr. Perkovich. That brings us Next to me, you are the Associate Director of the Watts Family Violence Center at Arizona State University, and with a strong background in law enforcement. Can you speak to us about your experience with that, first of all?
Of course, yeah. Actually, my career started at a pivotal year that you'll see here on the, or that I'll mention. I started my police career in 1994, just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. I was with a mid-size agency, about 600 total sworn, another 350 to 400 support staff by civilian. I was very fortunate to work an entire career throughout all the different bureaus within the agency, but I spent a primary amount of my time within the homicide unit, working family crimes, dealing a lot with intimate partner violence, intimate partner homicide cases. And to end my career, it was kind of really interesting to me, and I was very thankful in the sense that I ended my career as the commander over our statewide police academy. And that's going to come into play for this presentation today and some of the programs that I'm going to talk to you about. Because I think we mentioned the word training earlier, and training has got to start from the very beginning. And our programs are now taught in every basic training academy throughout the state, using universal terminology, a shared language. So when it comes to domestic violence fatality review teams and the concept of risk assessment that I'm prepared to kind of close out today talking about, we're creating a new generation of vernacular. We're creating a new generation of approaches to this phenomenon of domestic violence that's plagued all of our countries and communities for far too many years. So,
okay, thank you. The question of fatality review, what does it uncover that the case-by-case practice misses?
Yeah, first let me just point out, case-by-case review is oftentimes done by a profession or a singular sector. So take, for example, law enforcement. If they go back and do a review of their case to try to determine what occurred, where the gaps in services and so forth were, you're only getting one optic there. Whereby the opposite, if you employ a fatality review team, and for us in the United States, this started back in about 1993, 1994. In 1994, there was a very important act that was passed, a piece of legislation that was introduced by our two primary political parties. They brought it into our legislature as a nonpartisan or a joint party, which is oftentimes rarely, if ever, seen. And it created the Violence Against Women Act, and that was enabled in 1994. One significant thing, actually there were many significant things, but one of the primary things that came out of that was our government established the Office of Violence Against Women. Unfortunately, that's in jeopardy today with our current administration, looking to absorb it back into our Department of Justice. However, they've been our primary funder since about 1995 to enable us to actually do this work in the confines of fatality review. So if you're not familiar, obviously I have a timeline up on the screen right now that kind of shows, the genesis of fatality review work by my director, Dr. Neil Websdale, who you may be familiar with. Lifelong criminologist, we call him the godfather of fatality review. He's been doing it that long. And his true work and dedication and devotion to this concept and, again, the phenomenon of domestic violence within the home has really led to where we're at today. So you can see kind of the evolution of fatality review teams, what they're doing worldwide. I'd like to take just a few minutes for those that are in the room that may not be aware or understand what a fatality review team actually is. So when VAWA was established in 1994, that was also the birth of what we refer to in the United States of a coordinated community response. Those are three words that I heard predominantly throughout almost every session today. So the approach that we're taking falls in line and suit with what we know to be best practices. I think the last panel mentioned that it takes the entire community to address this issue. We know that we can't arrest our way out, we can't prosecute our way out, we can't spend our way out of something like this in all of our communities. And so I offer to you that DVFRTs, or fatality review teams, are the quintessential example of a coordinated community response. And if you're not familiar, representation on the team is produced from four primary sectors, the first being the criminal justice sector. This would include our friends in law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, even defense attorneys. That's followed with the medical sector. We invite in our medical examiners, our coroners, our nurses, our sexually assault trained nurses, and our mental health practitioners. Other members come from our service providers. This is our Child Protective Service, our shelter and housing specialists, our drug and alcohol treatment programmers, and then finally, rounding out the team, are members from the community. These are our faith leaders, our victim survivors, and researchers, which is the critical part of, I think, why we're here. We're looking for those data points, those data sets, what can indicate to us that these are best practices that should be followed. So the main purpose that really distinguishes a fatality review team, and by its mere name, of course, we're talking about a post-mortem analysis of what occurred, although we still operate within 3 other terms that I heard today. And that's with the main goals of prevention, protection, and accountability. And so members of the DVFRT identify and analyze homicides, suicides, near deaths, and other deaths caused by, related to, or somehow traceable back to this notion of domestic violence. The team operates in a no blame and no shame format. In other words, we don't single each other out. The purpose isn't to identify those wrongdoings and ridicule and accuse those that might have been a participant in what happened, but could have gone differently. Teams work cohesively in order to make recommendations and look to protect, prevent, and hold system players accountable. So how do they do this? The format of a team meeting, once a case is identified, and that's with the collective agreement of a team, and oftentimes it's done in a fashion of what is it that we want to learn in our communities. We mentioned protective orders today. We've mentioned protective orders that possibly have guns involved or firearm licensing. Those may be relevant subjects to what do we want to learn in the impact and the overall usage of protective orders, and if they're working. And so operationally, teams come together, and again, from what I've mentioned, teams can be anywhere from 18 to 25 people, all focused on the same case, all reading the same material, all processing it in a very different way based on their views, their lenses, their lived experiences. So they establish a timeline. Most teams go back to the birth of the parties that are involved, the perpetrator, the victim. They follow their lives through their lifeline. What past relationships they had? How did they grow up? What was going on in the home? Was there alcohol, drug abuse? Was there prior domestic violence in the home? Prior relationships. All of this is sought to get a better understanding of who these parties are. You can't pick up an investigation done by any police department and read about the incident that occurred and be able to draw logical conclusions and answer the big question of why did it happen. Most of the time you'll find investigations that cover the who, what, where, how, why for that incident and when. This goes beyond that. This takes a deeper dive, a deeper look into these atrocious incidents. So when teams look at these cases in greater detail, they marry the results of what they found. And this is communication coming from all sectors that then gets added to what was the aggregate data of the community. Does it support, does it uphold what it is that we've seen in much bigger numbers? And when we talk statistics in this, even in the biggest of countries, the N size or the sample size, fortunately by comparison of population, is relatively small. In communities, it's oftentimes measured with incidents per 100,000 population. Arizona has a southern community in our state that oftentimes is on number 9 on that particular list based on population. So statistics, you really have to understand, the context that they're being used. What we can show, the Department of Justice did a study after the enactment of VAWA, taking this concept of coordinated community responses, and they showed, and I think this slide is at the very end, but I'll kind of give you a quick preview. They showed from the period of enactment of 1994, the first 15 or 17 years or so, there was a reduction in intimate partner violence cases of roughly 70% involving women and approximately 60% involving men. So just for your knowledge sake, I know we've talked about, I think Guyana has 1 in 2 women. Most areas of the other countries are 1 in 3. The United States is about 1 in 4 women, about 1 in 8 men. So we do know that there are female perpetrators out there as well, and they shouldn't be overlooked.
Okay. What are the underlying requirements for this fatality review and risk assessment tools to work?
So really, it's the consistent participation. We've talked about a lot of the elements. Most of our coordinators in the United States, we have 50 states, obviously, independently, working with different laws, different policies, procedures, and so forth. A primary, I think, success came from several of our attorney generals throughout the states, embedded statewide coordinators for fatality review teams to be able to kind of help manage, govern, direct, respond, their capabilities with their lobbying to be able to lobby for new laws. Recommendations that also, they don't have to be at that law changing level. They can be, I'll give you an example. As a direct result of fatality review teams, there was an increase in obviously our strangulations that led to, again, far too many intimate partner homicides. And so our Attorney General's office, their lobbyists went in and lobbied for specific laws related to and governing just the act of strangulation alone. And then that was assigned its own, obviously, level in our felony system. Arizona practices an aggravating and mitigating sentence, which gives, obviously, judges quite a bit of latitude in what the sentence is. But that particular example is one very high-level example of a recommendation being adopted as a result of something coming directly from a fatality review team, because they saw it collectively. Like I think I mentioned at the very end, those community members that involve our faith leaders, survivors, victim survivors themselves. If you have them in the room, and us as professionals, we think we've done this. I've been in law enforcement since 1994. I think in certain areas I've developed an expertise, but I am never going to be able to see our systems through the lens of a victim. And so their input at that very moment, as they're looking at a case, they have that optic to be able to say, that would have never worked in my situation, or that's exactly what I needed, and I never had access to it. And understanding, we've shown throughout history and studies that have been done, about 50% of the cases in North America happen when the victim is in complete isolation. And so the other 50%, obviously, we can trace back to system interaction and the various levels, both ending, though, in an intimate partner homicide case.
Thank you so much. Thanks again to the distinguished panel. I think we'll open to the floor now. We just have about 10 minutes. Any questions, comments?
Thank you. My question is, this one is for the first presenter that we had online. I hope she's still there. She is. Okay, good. With reference to the statistics you presented, I mean, I know you said that you were expecting somebody else to do that aspect, so I'm hoping that you can answer this question. Out of the statistics for persons who had sexual intercourse with young persons 16 and under, with respect to the other offenses, how many of those involved children as victims? And how does your platform count persons who have committed multiple offenses? Is that there's just a running count, so that at the end you don't really just get a count of offenses, but persons are double counted based on the offense? Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. No, it's for persons who have committed multiple offense, we're able to get that information because we do have our correctional management system, which would record persons who are reoffenders. So it's not a double count. We know the persons who are reoffending. So that's to answer your second part of the question. Regarding the data, if you don't mind, could you repeat that section for me? A question regarding the data?
Certainly. I just wanted to know, out of the stats that you presented, the persons who, you said there were, I think it was 320 offenses for sexual offenses for persons under the age of 16. So I wanted to know, based on the other of sexual offenses, rape, buggery, etc. Does that number include the persons under 16, or how did you account if any one of the persons under 16s were victims of the other crimes?
No, they were not victims of the other crimes.
Okay.
This number was just for persons under the age of 16 who were affected by the perpetrator.
Okay, I'm seeing a gentleman in the back. Okay, well, we'll come back to you, sir.
Thank you, Rob Atkin, Cayman Islands. Just to ask a question following on from that, in terms of the sex offenders register that you've got in terms of people, how are you sharing that data for people that travel outside of the region or go to other places? Is there anything been put in place in the region or internationally so that when people travel, those countries are aware of those offenders coming into their areas?
Well, thanks for that question again. At this time, there is no inter-region international collaboration, but at the sex offender registry, we have the sex offender who is intending to travel would have to seek permission from the sex offender registry and would give them permission to travel. But as it relates to inter-regional, to notify the area that they're going to say a sex offender is traveling to your region, we do not at this time provide that information. I'm not sure whether later on there will be some inter-region, international bilateral agreement, but at this time, a person is able to travel and we do not give the person any indication, any letter of notification to the receiving, to the host country to say this person is a sex offender. But we gave them permission to travel.
Thank you.
And that permission to travel is in our legislation, in our sex offender registry, that we are able to allow them to leave the country.
Okay. I think this
All right.
This is the final question.
My CTD would like to jump. My CTD would like to contribute also. Ms. Roger.
Yeah, man, I hope you can hear me properly. So I think that question is about risk. And even though we don't give that, what happens operationally though, similar to what happens in the case of Jamaica, that someone traveling to our country, of course, there's something called an e-manifest. And the country usually that the person travels to has connections with Jamaica, even though it's not formalized like that, to ensure that the person who comes into that country, whether they're coming through a visa application or just coming by way of possibly CARICOM, would have a sense of who is entering to the jurisdiction. So for instance, in the case of Jamaica, recently with a lot of voluntary and involuntary migrants, we have been alerted. It's not that they have to, but it's a matter of courtesy. So there is a management of the risk that we're looking at as we go forward. So it is not as exposed as it seems. Operationally, the teams work together.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Todd Fogelsong, University of Toronto. I'm interested in the composition of the domestic violence death review teams or committees that you've been studying. And I imagine that the composition, although you often find it to be multidisciplinary, varies not just within state, but across the globe, right? You had all these interesting examples or allusions to cases in other countries. And I'm wondering not so much about whether or not the composition of those committees determines their effectiveness, but whether the leadership, who leads the committee, matters, if you can make that determination. So for example, if it's run by nurses rather than physicians, or if it's run by someone in public health rather than in the justice sector, do you detect differences in the kind of recommendations that they try to make, extracting a positive insight out of a tragic incident? Is that something you've observed?
Yeah, so I think it's important to just kind of establish. So the center at Arizona State University, I co-direct the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative. So we're not out in the field to actually observe these teams. We're actually there providing technical assistance and support, similarly that we would do and we hope to do here throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. To speak to your question though, we always look, regardless of who's leading the team, that it's done with balance, that it's exclusionary to any type of political motivation, starting with case selection, and then seeing that through to what those final recommendations are. The primary location where fatality review teams are often housed are in the Attorney General's office and or the medical examiner or the coroner's office. Those are the two primary. Now, you're asking about the leadership of the team. Each team is set up to act independently from one another, of course, with their own team coordinators. So even though the team's primary location is housed within law enforcement or within the medical arena, the leadership of that team might be nurse practitioners or advocates or any number of those representatives that are on the team, and that oftentimes rotates. Most teams have within their statutory enablement what they do at year's end or biannually when they create their report. It should be all done de-identified, so there's no sharing of information, no sharing of fact patterns as it relates to cases, and it goes to multiple locations. It'll go back to our attorney generals in our respective states. It goes to our state legislature, our senators, our Congress people. It goes to our Peace Officer Standards and Training Board that governs police training. And that's where we get our accountability factors that come in. This whole process that we practice is based on the National Traffic Safety Board. In what they've done successfully over the last almost 70 years since it first came to light. We aspire to get the same level of adopted recommendations that office has, and they run about, on average, 85% of those recommendations made coming out of the NTSB are adopted by the airline industry, and we're all benefits of that. I mean, I got here safely on a plane, which was fantastic, but we have seen the reduction in air crash and an increase in air travel safety, and we hope to replicate that same thing with domestic violence-related cases.
Well, your last answer explained one of the questions I wanted to ask, that it's confidential, you don't go back to the actual cases and investigators and so. But I'm wondering if there's no utility in that. I'm not saying that the team or the board must do the recap or the feedback with the investigators or so, but to my mind, apart from it being just simply informing a macro policy, which I understand it to be, there has to be much more at the micro level, reaching the actual cultural change, behavioral modification, actually ending DV and GBV, first to do more with the answers to who are they and why did this happen? If we want to get to, without asking questions, putting a full stop at the end of any discussions on DV and GBV. So that's, but you answered my question about the role of the board. I just had a question for Prof. I too, like you, I'm not sure. Yes, you put down the mic, right? Let me pick it back up. I too, like you, I'm not so sure that public registries play any role whatsoever in recidivism. And I also think that they lull us into a false sense of safety. I disagree with you that all of the cases, or the majority of the cases, the victims know their perpetrators. For example, in Trinidad, there's a high incidence of sexual offenses committed by persons who pose or mask as taxi drivers, unregistered taxi drivers. So to me, that is something that you might want to consider. What are your views on allowing certain types of groups or categories of persons to make a request to find out if a particular person is on a registry? For example, if you're hiring in the school system, whether it is the football coach or so. And then there's another issue when the victims are children. For example, I had one case where the perpetrator, and these are only the reported cases that reached the court, there were 4 separate victims over a spanning several years. All of the victims came from a particular pool. The pool was children in ministry at church. The perpetrator was involved at a sort of leadership level at church. Now, this is not something that I can see the police saying, well, yeah, you're not recruiting to hire, so you don't need to find out if everybody who you have in your children's ministry should be subject to a search. But isn't that important? That we ought to know if there are persons who are perpetrators of sexual crimes against children, that they should not be allowed in these sorts of environments. These are sometimes as simple as working the computer monitor right after service. And you're in a room with somebody, you understand? And that's where the majority of the offenses took place, a steady supply of children coming up. All right, so I'm not sure what your views are on that.
Right. So thanks for that. So just to clarify, I'm definitely not saying that lots of strangers don't do it. They absolutely do. But what I'm saying is that what we know from the evidence is that statistically that is a lot less than those who know who know them, who are known to the victims. And my view is always we have to be careful of enacting policy that caters to the minority of cases, particularly if it is something that for me infringes on rights. But certainly, of course, there are many strangers who do. So my answer to you, I believe this will answer both of your second two questions. We have police reports, and my view is always those exist. You know, we often argue as if those do not exist, and I absolutely feel, as I said, a well-monitored ex-offender is less of a threat to society than one who is monitored, and there are absolutely jobs that someone who has been convicted of a sex crime against particular victims should be kept away from. And for me, that is where we use the police reports, what we should use them for. Anybody that is going to, I think, take up a job, particularly with vulnerable groups, should be subject. You should be automatically asked to produce a police certificate of character. And the argument against that often is that, well, those things slip through the cracks. Okay, so then what's the point of a registry? You know, if you can't keep track of police certificates of character, then how are we expecting you to keep track of registries, which need to be kept up to date? Because I also want to add that if it is that we are advocating it, there have to be mechanisms for people to come off the registry as well, and that means that this has to be an up-to-date, dynamic thing. But my answer to your question would be that we need to make better use of the police certificates of character and not jump to another something more oppressive necessarily.
I think that was very, very important because you spoke about groups, and sometimes something as simple as Vacation Bible School. You may have some person who's in charge. Obviously, many little children there. It's not something that's established like a job that you would need a certificate of character, but you can find people, you know, preying on these young children who come for the religious instruction. Okay, I didn't understand. I didn't believe that being tail enders we would bat so long, and it appears that we had a lot more questions, but I'm sorry, we have to cut it here. One more question? Oh, well, this is the final question. See?
You see, that's when the tail enders win the match for the team.
Oh.
They keep on batting, right?
Well, that's different to the West Indies as they are now, but
no contentious conversation about West Indies cricket. I wanted to just quickly ask about the risk assessments. In the Trinidad and Tobago legislation, risk assessments are referenced twice. One, that the judicial officer could have and should have a risk assessment when deciding on the kind of protection order to be made. And second, the second moment is when deciding where there's a breach of a protection order, whether or not to grant, which is a criminal offense, whether or not to grant bail to the offending perpetrator. And the risk assessment there is also mandated. I think that the country has had a bit of a time trying to formulate what would you need to do to have a risk assessment? What would that tool look like? Who would have to be involved in not only formulating the tool, but operationalizing the tool in the context of reducing delay? Because these are decision points by the judicial officer and has to be made quite quickly. Do you have any experience in the development of a tool which is useful to the court in real time? And this on the, I don't know if you all discussed it, but I think on the question of the sex offenders registry, in Trinidad and Tobago, there was a very women's organizations, organizations working on gender-based violence were very much against a public registry because of the size of the country. We understand registries can stigmatize indirectly families of offenders, children going to school. It's a bit of a different dynamic when you're in a small society. So I don't know if you've been talking about that or what's your point of view on it. Does the benefit outweigh the harm to the indirect harm, the collateral damage? Thanks.
With regards to risk assessment, we didn't quite make it to that second question that I had here. I think it was just an issue of time, but I would love to meet with you offline and give you a very comprehensive answer, I think, for the benefit of the group. I don't know if we can go back to my presentation slides. Yeah. The second and third slide, I think, is so relevant to the question that you asked, because this is the risk assessment tool that's being universally used in the state of Arizona and is being slowly adopted throughout other states within our country. And as you will see from the questions that are being asked, and the relevancy of this is based on the coordinated community response, take like a domestic violence fatality review team. This was a recommendation that actually came out of a team and several teams. We need to be universally using risk assessment tools. And so Arizona developed this tool based on Dr. Jill Messing and Dr. Jackie Campbell's research. It differs in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, you'll see that it's divided into 2 tiers. Tier 1 is 7 questions, depicted on this slide. And then the next slide has an additional 11 questions that are asked. Now, the important aspect of this is twofold. One, this is presented by law enforcement at the time of a call for service. And if the victim is willing to participate and answer questions, they do so. They're also informed that this particular risk assessment tool is discoverable, meaning that it will be presented to a judge, it'll be presented to a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and potentially the perpetrator may see a copy of this. That was something that our Chief Justice in the Supreme Court of Arizona was very adamant about. So to answer the one part of your question, this tool is actually completed, distributed to those parties prior to the perpetrator seeing a judge for their initial appearance. This helps to better inform their release conditions and bail offenses. So again, the questions that are being answered here may not be relevant to the incident that resulted in the arrest. These are all allegations that are made and inform about the prior relationship history between the parties, but they are by law. In fact, Arizona's law listed at the very bottom, 133967, tells judges in our court system, if you see this form or any other risk assessment form, although this one was the only one that was validated in our state, you shall take it into consideration. Now, they're taking that into consideration with 14 other aspects of the perpetrator so they're not doing this in a vacuum. Well, the appraised risk assessment says that I must hold you and you must be bonded at this amount. There's still a lot of discretion that judges have when it comes to that release condition of the particular offender. And then the secondary use of it by time is it helps to better safety plan for the victim survivor and their families. And it may, on the third benefit, since these are allegations, they may be allegations that have been gone unreported to law enforcement that still have the potential to be investigated and potentially charged according to that perpetrator.
Can I just answer? Right, because I think you asked 2 questions. But first, in answer to your first question about the risk assessment, I think we in a region where we tend to have historically spoken about risk in a very nebulous way. We speak about risk a lot, but without actually measuring what the risk is. And we're only now waking up to an understanding of how important that is. And there are a number of really good risk assessment tools generally, a lot from Arizona State, actually, that we've started to be using within the Caribbean. And we've developed our own as it relates to issues such as gang violence and things like that. And so those are the type of tools like what he was describing there that need to be applied, standardized, validated tools for, to me, generally as it relates to crime prevention, but certainly are applicable here as well. In answer to your second question, my answer would be that depends on who you ask. I certainly would say that it is not worth it. Absolutely not as it relates to public registers. As I said, private is a little bit different, but as I said, for me, you have to balance that need for public safety, which is important, with understanding and adhering to human rights and understanding what it is really that these registries do. Because in the case of the public registries, for example, where there is a clamor in many countries for that, what is the point of causing harm to people and their families when it doesn't do what you think it's going to do anyway? But for some people, the answer to that would be, we don't care, they don't deserve that. But for me, I would say it is not worth it. So it depends on who it is that you ask.
Okay, we just want to thank you. We've had an opportunity to examine different methods. Together, these innovations form a toolbox to improve state response and intervene to prevent harm. Risk assessment, we learned, flag high-risk cases for immediate action. Sex offender registries can support ongoing risk-based supervision and cross-jurisdiction tracking. Fatality reviews audit outcomes and steer policy training and funding towards the highest yield gaps. And the Cambridge Harm Index and the MET V100 identifies and ranks the most prolific and high harm offenders, focusing, policing, and safeguarding where harm is greatest. We want to thank again our esteemed panel for coming with us and sharing their thoughts, and we want to thank you for participating. Thanks again.
Couldn't have said it better, but we do want to encourage you to continue the conversation, but over drinks, some nibbles, some good times, some East Coast fresh air. It's called a cocktail reception, and we highly encourage the networking session to continue.
Will that be available virtually?
You know what? Drink in spirit. Drink in spirit. Join us, please. We would never say no to a good time. Thank you all so very much. Now, as we conclude the first day of this regional symposium to advance state responses on domestic violence, we can all reflect on a day of meaningful dialogue, collaboration, shared commitment, and of course, the historic signing of the agreement by now 6 member nations. Together, we examined legislative gaps, explored innovative justice models, and identified concrete pathways to strengthen survivor protection and institutional accountability across the Caribbean. Now, tomorrow we are going to begin at 9 a.m. sharp with a powerful testimony shared by Ms. Tot Lamkin, mother of a domestic violence victim in the landmark Tot Lamkin versus Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago case. Her story will serve as a poignant reminder of the real human cost of institutional gaps and the urgent need for stronger, more coordinated responses to domestic violence. This is not to be missed, so we do ask you to be here and seated by 8:45 so we can have a prompt start at 9 a.m. A special thank you to our interpreters who have been quietly but diligently working in the booths. We see you and we thank you, and I hope that the headsets have been of good use to you as well today. Thank you so much for joining us for a productive day. I see a message barreling towards me, and that's fine too. Okay, perfect. So once again, the shuttles for the cocktail reception will be here at 6:30. So all of the collection will happen here. So for those of you who wish to go back to your respective hotels or rooms, if you're staying here at the Hilton, you may do so. You can freshen up. Remember, it's a nice casual atmosphere, and trust me, you want those Atlantic breezes to be hitting you good and proper, okay? So make sure you wear something cool, picturesque, take pictures, network, and again, continue the conversation. You are absolutely going to enjoy the Atlantis Hotel. So we wish you a beautiful night on the East Coast in beautiful Barbados, and we will see you back here tomorrow morning at 8:45.